Okay, so I guess before we get rolling, I should clarify that everybody understands the paper assignment. Does everybody understand the paper assignment? Any questions? I know it's a little convoluted.
I have one. And I know you sent me an email, so I'm sorry to ask you again.
No problem.
But you said that there is a physical copy of the first movie?
Yes. So since I sent that message out, I'm teaching an 8-week version of this course. And so in that one, because there's so much material to cover, I didn't feel I could adequately do it over Zoom. So we've been meeting in person for this last actually 7 weeks of the semester. And so since we're meeting in person, I ordered the film through interlibrary loan and it arrived lickety split. And when I went in and picked it up, they informed me that we own it now. And so they have purchased it sometime, well, they said they purchased it in August, right? So now there's a physical copy sitting in the library, which you can go over and watch, of the first film, Victory in the Pacific. But I can't stream it through Blackboard efficiently. And on YouTube, I can, the YouTube that's out there, I can only find the version that's missing one of the sections. So there is a physical copy, but I don't want everybody to rush over and get it. You can watch it in the library, right? It's, it's an hour, but I was not aware of that until just recently. But it wouldn't have made a difference anyway. There's nothing I can do with it because we can't, the library does not have a digital copy that I can set up a link to. Does that make sense?
I suppose it does, but couldn't you just, I know you know how to screen share, you do it for your lectures.
Correct.
Couldn't you put it in your computer? Does your computer have a disk drive?
It does not.
I see. Okay.
Right.
All right. Well, I thought I'd ask just in case.
Yeah, sure. No, I understand. And it, this is, I have had to rig it with reading the transcript. I will tell you, I've read the transcript and seen the film many a time. You don't lose much by reading the transcript. It's just a little disjointed that you stop watching it and then read, 10 pages of material of dialogue. It's not even really 10 pages. It's just the dialogue. And then you go back. So it is a little convoluted, but I don't, it's a trade-off I have to make because I was not happy with the other films I looked at for this particular assignment. This film does a lot of things I like for the assignment. And so because of COVID, I just had to rig it. Other questions? Everyone feels pretty good? Okay, so off we go. So where we left off on Monday, today's Wednesday, right? So on Monday, where we left off, we were talking about the second inaugural speech, court packing, and the loss of popularity for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There's one other point I want to clarify from the outcome of that, and then we can talk about international affairs. So when Franklin Delano Roosevelt begins to lose political power because of the three events we discussed on Monday, what is the impact for Franklin Delano Roosevelt in terms of politics? Anyone? Braden, you want to take a run at it?
Who did you say?
Braden.
Oh, okay.
His loss of popularity and when it regards in politics, he starts finding more opposition and finding it harder to pass what he wants, and some of his stuff starts getting rescinded.
Good. So when you talk about his opponents, who are we talking about?
Ooh, that I don't recall.
Okay, well, let's think about it. So who's going to be automatically opposed to what he wants to do?
Republicans.
Correct, right? But we know from the last electoral returns in 1936 that there's not many Republicans. So in and of themselves, they're not able to prevent passage, right? So the majority of people in the Congress are Democrats, right? But these Democrats are of a particular sort, right? And a assortment actually of people who support them. And so we talked about the creation of this juggernaut that Franklin Delano Roosevelt creates politically. He's got Northern liberals, right? He's got progressives. Progressives have moved from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party because they're achieving the things they want. He gets union support, right? Because unions used to support the socialists, but now here are the Democrats getting all the things that the unions would like, and so they support it. And then the African-American community, who used to vote Republican, voted overwhelmingly for Herbert Hoover, but now have switched parties, right? So those are four components of the Democratic Party, right? There's another part of the Democratic Party that we haven't discussed, but is a key part of the Democratic Party. Who would they be?
I have no idea.
Well, let's think. So we've talked about Northern liberals, right? We've talked about progressives, generally in the North and the upper Midwest. I didn't tell you that, but now you know. We've talked about unions, right? Unions are in a variety of places, but there's a region of the country which then and today is sharply resistant to unions. Where would that be?
The South.
Okay. And what is the political party of the South?
Republican.
It is today.
It's Southern Democrat.
Correct. And they have a particular hue. What would it be? What is their color?
You mean like of their skin?
Yes.
White.
They are white Southern Democrats. They are a sizable part of the Democratic Party. However, their outlook is decidedly different than other members of the Democratic Party. They are much more conservative. They see unions as radical activity. They're opposed to unions, right? So opposing unions as radical activity within the Democratic Party, you have a sizable part of the Democratic Party who are pro-union because they're union members, but then you also have a sizable part that are opposed to that. They're opposed to radical legislation, these conservative white Southern Democrats, right? So the legislation that the progressives and the Northern liberals are proposing is not something they favor. Generally, how do white Southern Democrats in the early 20th century feel about Black political rights?
They could care less.
Oh, well, they care, but just not in a positive way, right? So
They could.
Go ahead.
They rather them not have very many.
Correct, right? And we don't have to, project onto them this idea. We can look at what they do. And the South is marked by Jim Crow legislation. The South is marked by removing the voting rights of the Black population of the South, a process that began with the end of Reconstruction and continued into the 20th century, was to continue up until the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s, right? So this is a portion of the Democratic Party who is conservative and is opposed to many of the things that these other Democrats are trying to achieve. They hadn't opposed Franklin Delano Roosevelt before because they're afraid of his political power, right? They seek to modulate what Roosevelt can and will do. We referenced before that Roosevelt never backed an anti-lynching bill. It's not because he was afraid of irritating progressives, right? It was because he was afraid of what it would mean for his white Southern Democratic support. Now, these white Southern Democrats who are conservative are finding common cause with the Republicans. And they're beginning to block what they see as Franklin Delano Roosevelt's radical ideas, right? So part of the measure of political power is, one, the ability for you to get things done, right? That's sort of the definition of power, the ability to do work in a sense, right? So part of it is that, but the other part of it is that you're afraid to cross the person with power because he or she could make your political life miserable, right? Well, they're becoming less and less afraid of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's frittering away his political power, right, because of the decline of popularity in the summer of 1937 into 1938, right? And each day, they think, gets him one day closer to being out of office. So they're less and less concerned about what Franklin Delano Roosevelt can do for them politically or to them politically. And so they begin to find common opposition with the Republican Party. So Roosevelt's own Democratic Party are seeking to block some of the ideas that he's presenting, right? So now I'm going to draw on my Stephen Colbertism, right? So now shifting gears, we've been talking about domestic affairs for the length of time we've been talking about the New Deal. Now I want to switch to domestic affairs, how they impact international affairs, and then we're going to talk about the changing international climate in the 1930s as we accelerate to September 1st, 1939, right? So following the end of World War I, what did the United States do in terms of international affairs? What marked their policies, Kristen?
Isolationism,
Good. What does that mean?
kind of staying out of everyone else's business and just keeping to yourself.
Good. Is that true for everything in other people's business?
What do you mean?
Well, business. The United States continue to pursue
Oh, yeah. I get it.
international trade and banking. So in that realm, the United States did have a role, but in diplomatic and other international senses, the United States eschewed that role, right? So they retreated to isolationism. What justified this idea of turning your back on the nation, at least partly? I mean, on international affairs, not on the nation, at least partly. How did they feel about World War I?
They
They think it was a great idea that we got involved in World War I?
so they thought it was a bad idea we got involved.
Okay, so why did we, according to their thinking? Anybody help Kristen out?
People felt like we were tricked.
Okay, people thought we were tricked. What does that mean?
They saw that afterwards, after the war, there was these kind of people coming forward, particularly like historian and journalists.
Reputable people.
Yes, and they were having these findings about explaining how the U.S. was tricked, basically because of money and needing to get the payback that they had kind of invested. So
Invested
into the war and into, I think, Britain.
Okay, the Allies, right? The United States had been open for business, right? Although Woodrow Wilson said we will be neutral in thought and deed. But because of the powerful British Navy, only the Allies showed up for business, right? So prior to the US entry to the war, the United States sold prodigious quantities of material to the Allies for the war effort. So much material that the Allies had to adopt the Wimpy policy, in which I will gladly pay you Tuesday for war munitions today, right? And so the argument that was presented was that the United States involved itself in the war not for the high-minded ideals that Woodrow Wilson had proclaimed about making the world safe for democracy, all the things contained in the 14 points, right? We're going to make the world safe for democracy. This is going to be the war to end all wars. There's going to be no victors, no special treaties, all these, no punishment on the losers, all these things that Woodrow Wilson had held out as the reasoning the United States entered the war. These isolationists said, no, that's not true at all. The truth of the matter is we just want to make sure we got paid. Because if the Central powers had won, Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Turkey, then we wouldn't have gotten our money. So the argument runs. Now, ideas of this sort are nothing new in history, I suppose. My colleague, Jeff Hayton, just gave a talk about the German big lie following World War I and made analogies to the latest political big lie in which an untruth is asserted repeatedly in hopes that somebody will start believing this truth. So misunderstanding of the events related to the United States entry into the war are one thing, but they begin to have practical impact. And one of the places they have practical impact is in the United States Congress, because there was a widespread feeling that the United States had been tricked into this war between the European powers. Well, then there was assertion that we wouldn't be tricked again. And so one of the things that goes along that way is the passage of legislation to prevent us from being enmeshed in World War I again, right? So there's a series of legislation I'm going to talk about in a second, but first I want to give sort of the tenor of this idea of how rhetoric can replace reality, right? So I'm actually going to talk about something before the Roosevelt administration. And it's known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact was negotiated by the French Foreign Minister Briand and the Secretary of State Kellogg, in which the outcome of this is a document that nations will sign declaring that they will not resort to war to solve international conflict. And with great fanfare, lots of nations signed on to it. And so there was this kind of fervent belief that, you know, oh, thank goodness we won't have another war like the previous disaster, because, you know, nobody's going to go to war because they've signed this piece of paper. The problem is this Kellogg-Briand Pact had no enforcement mechanism. There was really no way to compel a nation to adhere to its signatures, aside from goodwill, I suppose, right? Now, that in and of itself, the passage of useless information or useless legislation, either at the local or international level, that is not new either. But the problem is nations began to make real decisions based upon this fantasy belief that war was no longer an option. So they declined to continue to invest in their military. They declined to, in the case of the United States, involve themselves diplomatically, right? Because this idea that we don't need to do so means that, you know, I'm glad that problem's solved. But international relations are sometimes marked by people not adhering to their agreements. And there's very little in Kellogg-Briand to actually compel anything aside from bad will, right? Other things began to bubble up in the form of the United States Congress. And the first is the Neutrality Act, right? So one of the arguments that we had been tricked into World War I was that we began to supply lots of goods to the Allies, and we sold them things on credit that they were going to pay back later, right? So we extended credit to them that built up debt, right? So that's part of it. The other part of it is we delivered this stuff to them and helping to deliver not only non-military things like grain and clothing, right? But also military things like weapons and gunpowders and shells, right? So because we're delivering these things that are purchased, it put US ships into the war zone where they could be sunk by German U-boats, which they were. And so sinking German U-boats outraged the American public, leading to this fever to involve itself in the war, right? So this again is part of the explanation that was popularly held. and it manifests itself in legislation. So there's a law passed in Congress that will prevent the United States from trading with any nation engaged in conflict. So the idea is, if the great empires of Europe go to war, let's say Britain and Germany go to war, we're not going to trade with the Germans, nor are we going to trade with the British. That way they can fight it out and we won't be drawn in. This is legislation that is really designed to prevent us from being dragged into World War I, right? But we're past World War I and we're in a different world. But this legislation does not address that. Now, during the Great Depression, this is a global depression in which many nations around the planet are mired in desperate circumstances. And these many nations are pursuing different political patterns, right? So we have the great democracies, Britain, France, the United States. We have new states that were created at the end of World War I, as we see in the film from the end of World War I, talking about the Treaty of Versailles. And so we see the creation of the nation state of Poland, of Czechoslovakia, of Hungary, of Austria, new nations that are created out of the wreckage of the Austro-Hungarian Empire primarily, but also territory taken from the German Empire as well, right? So these new states are created, and their guarantees are of their protection are from the Allied powers. The British and the French guarantee their safety, right? So they negotiate treaties with them to protect them against some sort of outside conflict, right? These policies are policies that are linking these democratically elected governments together. But there's other governments that are formed as well. And these governments are grouped under the heading of fascist states. And these fascist states are a different type of political organization. And during the Great Depression, these fascist states appear to be recovering or doing better in the Great Depression than the great democracies, right? So these fascist states begin to recover economically. Now, to some degree, this is because they were already enmeshed in the Great Depression before we got in, before the Great Depression came to the United States. So in Germany, the late 1920s were marked by desperate circumstances in the German state that eventually led to the rise of the Nazi Party and the assertion of control by the head of the Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler, creating a fascist state. And as this fascist state, they begin to put people back to work. And how they put people back to work is creating many of the infrastructure elements of a modernized military machine. So they put people to work making aircraft, right? Bombers and attack aircraft. They put people to work beginning to make tanks. They put some of the unemployed to work in the business of soldiers by inducting them into the army, right? And training and drilling them. And so all this stuff is state expenditure, right? So these states are building up debt. We know today how they were planning on resolving these debt problems, but it's not so apparent at the time. So as it looks like the German state is recovering, the idea of fascism as the way to respond to this economic difficulty begins to seem attractive to people around the world. Like, hey, those Germans are onto something. We know how the Germans intended to resolve their debt. Jack, how are they going to solve their debt problems?
By conquering their neighbors.
Right. Taking other people's stuff, right? That is what their plan is. Now, they may have stated it baldly at some times, but it was not something that was generally accepted. Oh, this is how the state is going to operate. They're going to expand their military and then start taking the possession of their neighbor's stuff in order to benefit themselves. Fascism carries within it this idea of the supremacy of the state and the people who are members of that state. this idea that we are superior to others means that it is only natural that we would come to rule other peoples, right? And so that's bound up in the notion of fascism, but it wasn't fully recognized at the time, although the fascists were certain to make that clear. So there's things that are going on in the international arena that a lot of people in the United States overlooked, right? Or weren't paying attention to because they were busily engaged in their isolationist stance of trying to solve the problems in the United States. So looking at other states was considered a distraction from looking at the problems at home. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt is really suffering a hard go about watching what he sees as alarming events in the international arena and being hamstrung in his ability to respond to it. So fascist states need to have empires, right? If only for to reflect how great they are as a people, right? And they also are looking to find ways to satisfy problems they have by taking outside resources. So first I want to begin with the Japanese. The Japanese had transformed themselves in remarkably short order into a modern industrial economy and nation. And a modern industrial nation needs lots of stuff. And Japan has lots of stuff, including lots of Japanese, but it's lacking in some of the key elements of a modern industrial economy. For example, it lacked substantial iron deposits. Iron is key for making steel. Steel is the sinews of modern industrial economies and modern industrial militaries, right? So they're lacking that ingredient. They have coal, but the coal is insufficient for their needs, right? So they need additional coal. They are completely devoid of petroleum, oil and gas. In fact, in the present day, Japan still imports more than 97% of its oil and gas that it uses, right? That was true in the 1930s. Japan does not have substantial oil and gas. And of course, petroleum is the fuel of modern industrial economies and again, modern industrial militaries. And so the Japanese, with the sense that their superiority should be recognized in the form of an imperial Japanese empire, began to look about for places that had the stuff they needed and that they could acquire access to in one fashion or another. And so having already turned the Korean Peninsula into a Japanese colony, they cast their eyes further afield into the Eurasian landmass on a region that was controlled by China known as Manchuria. And Manchuria is full of iron and coal and other mineral deposits, many things useful for modern industrial economy. The problem, of course, is that Manchuria does not belong to the Japanese. Well, they resolved that by taking Manchuria. So the Japanese invaded Manchuria, killing lots of Chinese in the process of taking it and threatening the Soviets not to interfere because the Soviets also border the region known as Manchuria and also had designs on Manchuria. And the Japanese seize it. And then they wait to see what happens, right? And so this is a clear case of one nation violating the rights of another nation by seizing part of their territory. This is something the League of Nations was designed to address, right? The League of Nations issued some sternly worded diplomatic cables. They shook their fingers at Japanese behavior and tutted these activities. The United States, not a signatory of the League of Nations, as we know, searched about for how they could make their displeasure known. But the problem was we're in the Great Depression. So not even the idea of imposing a trade embargo, a relatively low level response, was entertained because, well, we need all the trade we can get. So the Japanese seized this territory, committing atrocities to get it and to maintain their control and to divert the resources for their own empire use with almost no effect. This was a lesson that the Japanese filed away, right? This tactic created a diplomatic storm, but really no penalties, right? So they filed that away as they continued to expand their control of portions of China. In Italy, the dictator by the name of Benito Mussolini was preaching that the Italian nation needed to become a new Rome, right? And a new Roman Empire carries with it this idea of empire. So Italy must have other places to be part, to continue this tradition of Italian greatness, right? Of Italian superiority. But the problem for the Italians as they cast their covetous eyes about is that all the territory had been carved up by other European powers by this time. So the entire continent of Africa, with a few exceptions, had been carved up into colonial control by other nations in Europe. So the Italians, looking about, found the one independent nation of Africa known as Ethiopia, and decided that they needed to take over Ethiopia to have an overseas colony. So the poor Ethiopians were invaded by the modern industrial Italian Army, Navy, and Air Corps, who unleashed their military might on the poor nation of Ethiopia, right? Again, unprovoked. Again, this is an assertion of imperial or fascist expansion, right? And one for which there's and I guess in terminology, good guys and bad guys, right? And so the Italians are the bad guys in this operation. So there should be some support for the Ethiopians. But in the United States, they had passed legislation about the Neutrality Act in which the United States could not help a nation that was invaded. It didn't say anything in the law about what happens if one nation's rights are violated by another in the form of an unprovoked invasion, right? Nothing in the law. So they decide to change the law in Congress to cash and carry. What does cash and carry mean? Grady. Cash and carry mean? Grady, if you're trying to talk,
Cash and carry.
go ahead.
To me, cash and carry sounds like cache of weapons.
Well, it's CASH.
Oh, cash and carry.
Uh-huh. Ivy, can you help him out? Ivy, can you help Grady out with this? She doesn't want to help you, Grady. Ivy, you're trying to talk, you're still muted if that's the case. All right, who wants to help
like
Grady out?
of materials and stuff.
Okay, so let's
like
work
that.
our way through it. So cash and carry. So what are we talking about in cash? What could that refer to?
Money and allocated funds.
Okay, so let's think about what these neutrality acts are designed to do, right? So the neutrality acts are designed to prevent us from being drawn into World War I, right? So what is the argument that some people made, many people made, to say why we got involved in World War I?
For the money.
Okay, for what money? How does money figure into this equation?
Like the materials required for war and stuff.
Okay, who was buying them
Uh,
and who was supplying them?
Europe
Europe was what?
buying them.
Buying them from who?
The United States.
And were they paying in gold and treasure?
No,
What were they doing?
wasn't it just like a write-off type thing? All the IOU.
Yeah, they put it on debt, right? So some of which, they paid with gold and treasure. The banks of London emptied their vaults of gold, and it was deposited in New York. It was a transfer of wealth, which is why the United States became the international banking sector, replacing London. London spent down its reserves buying or prosecuting the war. Some of that material come from the United States, but they put it on debt. So now let's think about what the cash means on cash and carry. The United States got drawn into the war, according to this argument, because we had to make sure the Allies won so they could satisfy the debts to our munitions factories, right? So what does the cash mean in cash and carry then? How is this designed to prevent us from being drawn into it again?
So if other people would just paid off their debts immediately, then we wouldn't really have to have as many problems in being held up with other
Correct.
nations.
Correct. What the cash and carry part of this means, instead of saying you owe us the money, it's a cash only sale. So if you want to buy stuff, we'll trade it to nations engaged in war, but there's no debt. There's no bill me later. You have to pay cash on the barrelhead, right? So part of the argument that we got tricked in the World War I is because the Allies owed us money, so we had to ensure they won, right? So that's part of the argument, right? Cash. So they modify the Neutrality Acts in light of what's going on between Italy and Ethiopia and say, well, the Ethiopians can now purchase material from us, but they have to pay cash, right? What's the carry part? Kristen, you want to help me out with the carry part? Go ahead, Kristen.
The transport, they would have to transport it themselves as opposed to the US transporting it.
Okay, why?
Because in World War I, when they were transporting it, they were running into German U-boats and they were ending up getting sunk and helped drag them into the war.
Correct, right? So cash and carry is a modification of the Neutrality Acts, and it's designed to avoid these pitfalls, but also to respond to the reality that the Italian invasion of Ethiopia has demonstrated, right? What has it demonstrated? One nation can be an aggressor against another, and this piece of legislation, as the Neutrality Act, doesn't allow us to help the people who are being attacked. So modifying it in cash and carry is designed to fix what they see as this problem, but still avoid the pitfalls of being dragged into the war, right? It doesn't help the Ethiopians. They have neither the cash nor the ability to come pick up stuff and carry it back, right? So it doesn't help Ethiopia, but the inability of the United States to involve itself to help the Ethiopians who are being attacked unprovokedly by the Italians it reveals the shortcomings in the law. So that's why they modify it. But it's still fundamentally about preventing us from being drawn into World War I again, right? The Italians suffer minor penalties for this unprovoked assault and occupation of Ethiopia, right? They get a relatively short oil embargo imposed on them. But that, again, is fundamentally it, right? There's very little punishment for what these nations are doing, these fascist states are doing in their expansion. I'm going to talk about one more comparatively minor, although it turns out to be have a role, and then we're going to talk about the big threat when we talk about Nazi Germany. So in Spain, Generalissimo Franco took his Spanish army across from North Africa and invaded Spain in order to topple the government and install himself as fascist leader of Spain. And so this set off the Spanish Civil War, pitted leftists against what were called rightists, the conservative fascists, right? And so the leftists were supported by the French and the Soviet Union with some money and limited munitions. Some radicals around the country rallied to the leftist cause, trying to resist this insurrection by the fascist General Franco, and including people from the United States who formed what was called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, who went to fight against fascism, right? So this is somewhat of an international affair. Franco was supported by the Italians and the Germans with money, munitions, and in the case of the Germans, with air power, where Adolf Hitler and his military officials took the opportunity for the German pilots to get a little training in actual live combat. And so German aircraft flew air support for Franco's armies. The outcome is Franco wins the Spanish Civil War, installing himself as fascist leader of Spain, which he would remain fascist leader of Spain until I think he died in 1975, but it's sometime in the 70s, right? So this fascist government is installed with the assistance of other fascist states, the Italians and the Germans, right? And it is, of course, the Nazis who represent the biggest threat. Adolf Hitler mounted to power in Germany in 1933. The culmination of his political rise, built upon the big lie, as my colleague Jeff Hayton was talking about last week. This big lie was that Germany had been stabbed in the back, and that the humiliations imposed on them from Versailles were insults that could not be adhered to. So Hitler wanted to create a greater German state. And this greater German state was a fascist enterprise that was going to expand. Before he could expand, he had to begin to rearm the state. Under the Versailles Treaty, the German military was limited to 100,000 members of the army, and there were limitations on aircraft, tanks, and naval ships, right? Hitler was planning on ignoring all of those limitations, but before he could do so, he had to gain control of the industrial heartland that produces these things for modern industrial militaries. He was hampered by the fact that the industrial heartland of Germany, a place known as the Ruhr Valley, had been occupied by the French. And it had been occupied by the French because the Germans weren't meeting their reparations bill that had been imposed on them as the people who had the blame for World War I. And so they couldn't make the payments every year to the French. And so the French said, well, since you're not making the full payments, we're going to take over the mines, the steel mills, the factories of the Ruhr Valley in lieu of the payments you're not making. And so the French occupied the Ruhr Valley, a section of traditional German nationhood, and also the industrial heartland of Germany, right? It would be comparable to occupying the United States from Pittsburgh to Chicago, right? That industrial corridor, now tragically known as the Rust Belt, but in previous incarnations, the industrial heartland of the United States, right? So before he can do anything, act on any of his elaborate empire building schemes, he has to regain control of that. And so against the advice of his generals, Adolf Hitler orders this small German army to reoccupy the Ruhr and force the French to leave. The French decide not to contest this effort by Hitler. partly because they know that they really have no claim to the Ruhr Valley, right? It's not anything related to France. It's clearly German, right? So seizing this territory is not really, justified under the Versailles Treaty. The other part of it is they didn't want to go to war again, right? They didn't think it was worth going to war for. So when Hitler reoccupied the Ruhr, this generated enormous enthusiasm for Adolf Hitler and his nationalist ideas, his notions of the greatness of the German people, and also served as that key element for expanding his military. And so during this time frame, the German army began to swell with the production from the factories, the mines, the steel mills of the Ruhr, rebuilding German military might, making them increasingly a threat to the established peace. For the French and the British, not only aligned by treaty, but also the guarantors of these peripheral states close to Germany, this was met with increasing alarm. But the British and the French comforted themselves, I suppose, or at least as part of their calculations figured that German imperial ambitions would be partially offset by the colossus of the Soviet Union. So much in the way of World War I, where the British and the French were counting on the Russians to serve as this large counterweight to expanding German power, the French and British in the 1930s were counting on the Soviets, right? The government, the revolutionary government that evicted the Tsar, but installed itself as the governing power. And they hoped because the communists and fascists were on opposite ends of the political spectrum and avowedly hated each other, that they could count on the enmity the Soviets had for German fascists to serve as a counterweight. But throughout the latter stages of the 1930s, the German state provoked new controversies by continually seeking to expand, right? And the French and the British became increasingly nervous. Across the Atlantic Ocean, this was being observed with increasing alarm by the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who saw the rise of this fascist German state as a threat to international order and as a threat to United States interests. And FDR viewed this militarization that was occurring in Europe and knew that the United States would not be able to remain aloof from these events, despite what isolationists may fervently believe. And as he looked around the United States, he saw the United States was in desperate backwardness in terms of the military. They had not been engaging in maintaining the Navy. They had not been engaged in investing in training and creating a standing army. United States military force was quite weak. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt viewed this with alarm. He also viewed the expansion of the Japanese empire with alarm. So as these events are unfolding, FDR is seeking to make some changes. He wants to invest in US military capacity. He wants to call attention to the problems that he sees on the international affairs that are of the interests of the United States. But he is derided by his critics in the United States who say he's merely trying to divert attention from the failures of his administration, and that the affairs of Europe do not affect us. And so the Congress and the general public remain deeply isolationist, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was becoming increasingly alarmed. In late August 1939, there was a diplomatic bolt from the blue which was terrifying to the French and British. I'll go as far as saying terrifying. And it came in the form of something known as the Molotov von Riben-Tropped Pact. This was a public announcement of a pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany to announce that they would not go to war with one another. This was deeply alarming to the French and the British, who had very little inkling that this negotiation was going on, and they had very little idea how they could respond to it, because they had been counting on the weight of the Soviet Union to serve as a potential check to expanding German militarization. And now, in a bold statement, that had been removed from concern for the Germans, at least publicly, right? And so that public announcement was shocking, came as a shock to everybody. It also had secret corollaries, which the other powers did not know about. And they run like this. The Nazis said to the Soviets, we're going to invade Poland. And we're going to invade Poland up to this line. We have no interest in engaging in conflict with the Soviet Union. And we have no interest what happens to the rest of Poland beyond this line. We're just taking up to here. And the Soviets said, we have no interest in going to war with you, right? So we will not prevent you from going up to this line. And they also included as sweeteners in the deal, we will ship you X amount of steel, coal, and raw materials and things as a token of our goodwill between the two states. That was the secret corollary. The Germans told the Soviets that they were going to invade Poland. And they made good on that promise on September 1st, 1939, when the German war machine, on a pretext, invaded Poland. They said they took some Polish soldier or Polish prisoners out of German prisons, dressed them up in Polish uniforms, and shot them and left them on a railroad crossing that connected Germany and Poland, and said the Poles had invaded Germany, and so unleashed the German war machine on Poland. Well, poor Poland suffers the onslaught of the German war machine. And as their guarantors, the French and British honor their agreement to protect Poland and declare war on Germany. And so the Germans honored their secret agreement with the Soviets, invading up to a certain line and then no further. And in fact, at times they went past the line and the German columns turned around and went back, right? And as the Germans were dismembering the section of Poland they had claimed, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, gobbling up the rest of it. And Poland was dismembered between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. In the West, as it was referred to, the German and the French were bolstering their defenses and expecting the revisiting of the First World War, that this was going to be a long, bitter struggle of trench warfare, of a war of attrition that would take many years to grind down the Germans and hopefully protect France from this expansionist Germany, right? And so this period of the winter of 1939 into, or the late fall and early winter in 1939 into the winter of 1940, not much is going on the Western Front. And the United States was eyeing these things, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, with alarm, other members of the United States with confusion. Why would these European powers resort to this awful slaughter of war again? Thank goodness we're not involved, right? Because the sentiment was, this is not our problem. This is European problems, right? And then the Germans unleashed their war machine on France, and in short order destroyed the French army and chased the British expeditionary force back across the English Channel, back into Britain, leaving their equipment behind. And what had been projected as a year-long slow war of attrition was instead a weeks-long lightning dash by the German panzer divisions, who destroyed what was the largest military, or the second largest. The Soviets had the largest military, second largest military, and considered the most powerful military on the planet, the French army, in a matter of weeks. And Adolf Hitler, for those of you who may still question the relevance of historical events, Adolf Hitler had the rail car that the Germans had surrendered, had signed the armistice in 1918, had that rail car removed from the museum, dragged to the exact same patch of woods where the Germans had been forced to capitulate, and brought the French military leaders, sat them down and said, now you sign your defeat. And the French signed their surrender to the Germans in the exact same rail car, in the exact same piece of woods that they had forced the Germans to sign in 1918. Now, the United States is becoming more alarmed, because as they look around, the United States military was ill prepared for conflict, but there was still this deep resistance to getting involved. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt was hamstrung in trying to help the British, because he wanted to help the British against the Nazis, right? And so he couldn't sell them sufficient arms because the British didn't have enough money. And he couldn't evade the legislation directly that Congress had imposed on him. So he came up with inventive ways to get around it. One is Len Lease. Who wants to tell me what Len Lease is? Kristen? Kristen, if you're trying to talk, we're not getting it. Pauline, you want to help Kristen out?
I believe the Len Lease was when it was, like you said, a way to get around directly supplying, or well, they still supplied, but avoiding the legislative that prevented FDR doing what he wanted to. He would lend out, I believe, the old and decrepit destroyers that they had, and the idea that, or no, lend out just or old materials and stuff with the idea that they would be lended back eventually, even though some of the items probably technically couldn't be lended back. It's just his way to, because it was kind of trading, so it fall under his jurisdiction.
Okay, so you're on the right path. You're kind of conflating two different things. One is the destroyer deal, and the other one is Len Lease. So let me clarify the destroyer deal. The decrepit and old and not needed battleships or destroyers that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was proposing, he was saying, we have these things and they're useful, but they're kind of old, right? And so we want to barter with the British. We're going to give them these old surplus destroyers, which were neither old nor surplus, but that's what he called them. And in exchange, we're going to get long-time leases on some British bases in the Caribbean. And Roosevelt argued this would offer more protection for the United States in the form of these bases than these destroyers. So we're making out on the deal, right? But it's not a sale. It's not a treaty, right? Things that have to go through Congress. It's a straight up barter. I'll give you that, you give me this, right? And so he's bartering these destroyers to get around congressional limitations, right? The Len Lease Act is another contrived way to get around congressional handcuffs, right? So we can't sell things on credit to other nations engaged in conflict, as the British clearly are. So they come up with new methods, right? And so Len Lease, he illustrates in a wonderfully homey example. And he says in one of his fireside chats, explaining this to the American public, what he's doing, but really helping to generate public support to prevent Congress from preventing him from doing it. He says, if your neighbor's house is on fire and you have a garden hose, you wouldn't sell your garden hose to your next door neighbor. You would lend him your garden hose so that he can put out the fire. And when he puts out the fire as a good neighbor, he will return your garden hose. And if in some fashion fighting the fire has damaged the garden hose, as a good neighbor, he will return a new garden hose to replace the one that was damaged, right? A wonderfully homey example. But he's talking about lending them aircraft and locomotives and tanks and bullets, right? So we're not selling them. They're not on debt. We're merely loaning it to them. This is, again, a way of evading the legislation that not only has Congress imposed, but because they're still isolationist, won't remove, right? So he's having to come up with these ways to help the British. And he extends these methods in helping the Soviets, because Joseph Stalin had no illusions about this deal, this pact with Adolf Hitler, because he said to his generals, gentlemen, prepare, because we will be at war with Nazi Germany in 1943. He mistook the timing, because June 22nd, 1941, the Nazis unleashed Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of the Soviet Union with the intent of toppling the Soviet government, right? And so a week after the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, Franklin Delano Roosevelt extended to the Soviet Union this Len Lease deal, right? Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a pragmatist. He said, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So he had no thoughts that Joseph Stalin was not a murderous dictator. He was, but he recognized that Nazi Germany was a bigger threat to the world and United States interests than the Soviet Union. And so, helping to defeat the Soviet Union, Franklin Delano Roosevelt extended these Lend-Lease agreements. So the United States is still not in the war. This war has begun in Europe in September 1st, 1939. It has now engulfed the Soviet Union. Oh, the French, by the way, surrendered June 22nd, 1940. 1 year later, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, and the United States is still not in it. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt is trying to figure out how the United States can continue to aid, and he believes the United States needed to be involved in the war against Nazi Germany because it represented such an existential threat. But he couldn't convince the American public to do so. That's where the Japanese came in to help Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? So remember the lesson for the Japanese was that they could steal stuff and then hunker down and wait things out. That's the lesson they had learned by seizing Manchuria. Well, the Japanese Empire had solved some of their supply issues, or at least addressed them in taking Manchuria, but they hadn't fixed the problem of oil and gas. So the Japanese decide they're going to have to get control of their own oil and gas sources. And Manchuria did not have known deposits of oil and gas at that time, but there was a region in Asia that did. It was called the Dutch East Indies. As the name implies, it was a Dutch colony, but it's now current Indonesia. It was part of a massive oil and gas deposit that had been used to produce oil and gas for the international market. So the Japanese are going to seize that. But in order to seize that from the Dutch, they're going to have to neutralize the British, because they know that the British are not going to be keen on them seizing this stuff. So they're going to attack the British colonies as well in Asia. And they don't think that Britain represents a serious threat to their imperial ambitions, but there is another Pacific power that does. And that Pacific power is the United States. And so they decide they're going to destroy the Pacific fleet of the United States at anchor, seize the things they need, and then hunker down and ride out the storm, because they don't believe that the Dutch can't stop them. They don't believe the British will be able to seriously impede them. And they don't believe the United States has the stomach for warfare. So their grand calculation is to seize the things the Imperial Japanese state needs and then wait out the storm and negotiate some sort of settlement with the United States when they realize that the Japanese aren't giving stuff back. So that's their plan. So on December 7th, 1941, they attack the fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor, launching the United States into the war. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a moment of panic because as much as he was alarmed by the designs of the Japanese and outraged by Pearl Harbor, he was more concerned about Nazi Germany. And so figuring out how to get the United States involved in the war against Nazi Germany gave him a couple days pause. And then Hitler, for reasons that are still unclear, solved this issue for him by declaring war in the United States December 11th. Now the United States is in the war, right? So the film we're going to see, or you're going to see the first film on this opinion paper is Victory in the Pacific. And I just want to set it up briefly, right? The United States was engaged in a war in what we call two theaters. There's the European theater and the Pacific theater. In the European theater, this was always job one. The United States identified Nazi Germany as the biggest threat to United States interests, even though the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And so defeating Hitler and Nazi Germany was job one. But the United States didn't have a very big military at the outbreak of war, or our entry into the war. We had a military that was smaller than the Greek military. I think we're the 18th largest military on the planet. That is insufficient for the needs of the conflict. And so the United States began to busily draft and equip and train an army to fight in Europe. But before that, the United States served as the main supplier. And so the Len Lease program delivered war munitions to the British, to the Soviets, and it is the Soviets who did the lion's share of the fighting. In fact, somewhere north of 79% of the war material and the soldiers killed and captured for the Nazis occurred on the Eastern Front. The Soviets bore the cost of this conflict with prodigious quantities of their blood. The United States and the British were engaged in the war, but the United States was relatively late in terms of this form of the conflict. So they produced the majority of the equipment that was used to defeat the Nazis. The United States eventually was able to insert a large army in which they contributed to the destruction of the German Empire, right? Fighting first in North Africa, later in Italy, and then finally June 6, 1944, when they invaded France and then fought across the continent on their drive to Germany. But Germany, the European conflict was always job one. The Pacific conflict was always the secondary theater, but the secondary theater was primarily fought by the United States. Almost all the blood spilled in the Pacific, or at least the vast majority of the blood spilled in the Pacific was spilled from the United States. The Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, and British, and some Dutch did, contribute to this conflict, but it's primarily the United States who prosecuted the war in the Pacific. And this method of prosecution took the form of what was called island hopping, in which the United States would invade an island, capture the Japanese-held island, and then construct airfields used to pummel other islands with the intent of hopping their way to the Japanese islands. So where the film picks up Victory in the Pacific, the you're to watch the second hour, right? Which is begins with the invasion of Okinawa. Okinawa is the last island in this island hopping program to get the United States close to the Japanese home island. After the capture of Okinawa, the plan is to invade the Japanese home islands. Same strategies across the Pacific. Now, Japan itself is in range of the long-range bombers of the United States and is being punished from the skies. But the intent is to invade the Japanese home island to force their surrender. In the same way that the Germans were forced to surrender. The Germans were forced to surrender when the Soviets and the Allies marched all over the capital, Berlin, and captured it, right? So what you're going to see is this tail end of the conflict. And I want you to know that this is, these events are in the spring and summer of 1945. The United States had been engaged in this bitter conflict since December 7th, 1941. So it's not something that happened immediately. This was years-long conflict that cost enormous amounts of blood and treasure in order to defeat the Japanese military. All right, so watch the two films. The opinion paper specs are up on Blackboard. If you have any questions, shoot me an email and I will see you, excuse me, I will see you next week.